Universalization of education is no more a priority for the government. Education has become a purchasable commodity. For example, take the budget for higher education itself. It's now being awarded to the higher education institution in the form of loans rather than grants. University Grants Commission has a word called grants. It used to provide grants to the higher education institution. Now it provides through HEFA, the Higher Education Financing Agency, basically loans. Whether it is central universities or any other institution, they receive not grants but loans, which impacts on the fees of the students, facilities, infrastructure, teaching, recruitment. In every possible way, universities are affected. Even a university like JNU is compelled to actually, you know, rent out its land or other facilities in order to mobilize resources. The University Grants Commission and AICTE, All India Council of Technical Education, suffered a cut in the last budget proceeding from the previous year of about 9,600 crore. It was a second consecutive year of cuts uh, for higher education and particularly IITs and IIMs also, though a large part of the central sector budget goes to these very institutions. But the sufferers were state universities even to the larger extent because the UGC and AICT, whatever funds they were providing earlier, that saw a 70% reduction. If you really look at, you know, this whole process where SCDG, the socially disadvantaged group, socio-economically disadvantaged groups, are going to be the main sufferers. And in fact, the GER, the gross enrollment ratio in these cases, has been always below the national average. Even now, it is below the national average. Uh, if you look at the national average of the GER is about 27.3%, with women reaching only 24.9%, scheduled caste reaching only 23%, and scheduled tribes reaching only 18.9%. So the impact of these slashes and cut is very, very clear. It's also a cut for research. In fact, the ANRF, the Ansandhan National Research Foundation, which was allocated, supposedly allocated 50,000 crores, it was learned that actually much of this money will come from philanthropic organizations and private sector organizations. Government allocated only uh, close to 5 to 6,000 crores only. And the year the last previous year or year previous to that, it was only 2,000 crore, and spent also was very little. Now that it may, in fact, see an increase in spending as far as the NRF is concerned, but what we are going to see is a privatization of the R&D funding itself. Higher education institutions are supposed to do teaching as well as research. This is the case with higher education and research. If you look at school education, universalization of education, I said, is not a priority. And in school area, if you look around and literacy case, 30 crore of our population is illiterate. The illiteracy rate is higher among Dalits, Adivasis, and fisher folk and the other backward classes population. Lakhs of schools of lakhs of students of school age group are out of school, even after the institutionalization of Right to Education Act 2008. Right to Education Act lays down the minimum physical and academic infrastructure requirements for the schools. Most government schools till now and private schools in most cases do not have these standards fulfilled. So whatever standards have been prescribed are not followed because of shortage of funds, because funds are not allocated. The consequences are immediately for, again, socio-economically disadvantaged groups, the groups which I just mentioned. 47% of children drop out before even completing the grade 10. Dropout rates among SC and ST are very, very high. So if you look at whether it is school education or it is research or it is teaching at the state level as well as at the central sector, we have seen a cut in the allocations because universalization of education is not a priority. And even whatever school education fund was increased, much of it is given to what I call the PM Shri schools. We have a multi-layered school system. We used to earlier have central schools and other common schools. Now we have a number of other layers of schools. Eklavya model schools. Put together, these schools actually are the instruments of the central government to ensure that the state governments fall in line. State government implement NEP. Though many of the state governments have apprehension about National Education Policy 2020 and they don't want to implement it. But the allocations are done in such a manner that the state governments are compelled to fall in line. So the overall budget direction which we have seen does not work for the Dalits, doesn't work for the other backward classes, minorities. Their scholarships have been withdrawn. So, be in higher education or in school education, we are seeing a social exclusion. Socio-economically disadvantaged groups have been the main victims have, of this slash in budget. But the structural aspect of the problem is the Right to Education Act, though it was supposed to actually provide certain measures, has not worked, and it's because the private schools were not interested and the government schools were not seeing any rise in their allocations. So the sufferers were, as I pointed out, these very Dalit groups, SC, ST, and girls, as you rightly pointed out. So if you want to deal with this question of dropouts of the vulnerable communities, the solution is common school, neighborhood schools. This was recommended in the Kothari Commission report. Common school was supposed to be built around the neighborhood schools. It never got built around. What we have been seeing is the privatization of school education. And neighborhood schools, common schools, would mean that whether it's the children of rich or whether of one caste or another caste, all of them will go to one school in the neighborhood. Now, this would also make way for remedial education. Because if there's a language challenge or any other challenge with regard to maths or any other uh, course, the schools would provide for support for remedial education to these very children as far as it's concerned. And there'll be no multi-layered schools system like PM Shri schools and Eklavya model schools. All schools would get support and the required support as laid down in the RTE Act. That's the way to go forward as far as universalize the education system is concerned, to reduce the dropout rates is concerned. And if you look around, uh, what this government has been actually arguing for, that even a child can learn at home as far as it's concerned. If you look around, they have relied on far more on digital education, online education in the higher education area. So, in fact, that was the case even in school education during COVID, as far as it's concerned. In the case of higher education, 40% of the courses are actually from now MOOC, which is an online digital education platform, as well as concerned. Government has been implementing CUET, Central University Exam, CUET is a centralized university examination test. It actually has impacted socio-economically disadvantaged group far more than others. I can take the example of a Stephen College in Delhi. which is a prestigious college. I learned from the teachers here that you know they have now students from very fewer states. Concentration is there of the fewer states, as well as people from socio-economically disadvantaged groups are absent in the schools, colleges. So schools and colleges both are seeing exclusion. And the way to go about it is to really build a system which values equity and doesn't centralize. In fact, it makes education relevant at the state level. What we are seeing in the last, few years under the NEP, rather right from 2020, that centralization is being preferred. You are preferring courses which even exclude the content which would actually argue for equity, environment, freedom struggle, which actually is going to is presented in a manner that you want to establish again a caste society. A caste society through textbooks established via teachers and structures which are themselves exclusionary is certainly going to impact the vulnerable communities far more than anybody else is concerned. They will face the discrimination. If now neighborhood school or commonhood schools were there and the content was secular and the content was universal, content was aligned with the constitutional values, then the vulnerable communities would be less impacted, and the remedial education would be far more successful. Universalization of education will have to be a priority, and particularly of Dalits and the socially excluded and disadvantaged groups, would have to become a priority, and education will not be a purchasable commodity. It will not be dependent on loans. Education would be actually seen as an investment in the nation building as far as concerned. Today, I pointed it out that the attempt is to corporatize education, depend on philanthropy, depend on a complete centralization. Whole NEP is the attempt to actually centralize education under and the center. Vice chancellors would be appointed by center through the governors, and the UGC new guidelines. If you look at, that's what they pointed towards, and the state governments are opposed to it. So the first thing is center state balance should be restored. It was used to be education used to be a state subject, then it became a concurrent subject, and so now it's becoming over centralized, and centralized altogether is what the direction that the NEP has taken. Now that is, take the case of RUSA funds, which are at the moment being used also to create new types of schemes which actually work for cluster colleges and all. See, there has been closure and mergers of schools. I forgot that should not happen because that would impact the girls far more and the SC students. That is because the marginalized groups, if the school closed and the distance increases, then children won't be able to go to those schools because parents won't be able to take them to those particular schools because they would be far away. The distance would be far more. And schools should be there in neighborhood and common school. As I said, that's the way to actually build an ideal system. It's same in the case of higher education and research. Don't corporatize it. Don't centralize it. Make it relevant to the states. And I was just pointing out the RUSA scheme, which is higher education institutions where block funding, whatever is being used by the center, rather give it to the states. Let the states determine the priorities as far as this is concerned. You can, in fact, mobilize funds. There's no dearth of funds as far as this is concerned. A tax can be put on the corporate sector, the wealthiest individuals. Inequality has grown during COVID and even right continues to increase as far as is concerned. We can target public expenditure of 6% of education for of GDP for publicly funded education easily if the corporate and the wealthiest and individual people pay taxes, higher taxes. Idea of you know a ideal a system which actually was envisaged in Higher Education Commission of 1948 itself. That is the Radha Krishnan Commission. Actually, it gave autonomy to the universities. The university faculty, that is teachers, students, together would run the university as a democratic institution. Today, it is being run through the governors, being run through the central government, to the ministries. That is not the way to run an ideal system, neither fund it nor govern it. And and certainly scrap the CUET and the scrap NTA, the National Testing Agency, which is messing up so many cases. Students had to pay a price for it, etc. Give up. Online education is not the way forward. That's why really in-person interactive learning, connection with the local context and the relevance of education to the local needs is the way to go forward to build a system which would be. In fact, you look at if higher education in IITs and IIMs, I began with that as far as it's concerned. Today, many of its students are actually going for not engineering or science. They are doing finance finally. They are not getting employment as far as it's concerned. They're not getting placement. Placements in IITs and IIMs have come down. So a system which does not get complemented by public investment in industry, state-owned institutions, and public sector organizations which are not funded for manufacturing as well as high-tech emerging technologies, and it is you depend on foreign direct investment to actually build your industry. And even in agriculture, which was built on publicly funded, ICR system, Green Revolution, that's how it took place. Today is now funding private agriculture university. Much of the agriculture today, education now advance that has taken place to the private sector under NEP, National Education Policy. 100 new universities have come up between 2020 and 24. All the majority of those 100 universities are private universities. Private universities exclude socially, uh, economically disadvantaged groups. The ideal system would be, which is a publicly funded system, a system which sees education as an investment, doesn't treat it as a purchasable commodity, doesn't make students depend on loan, who have to pay then later all the time, like the American students pay. All the time they are indebted. And India is a country where poor people cannot afford such a system as far as concerned. The ideal system would be publicly funded, balance in center and state relation. It would be far more relevant to the states would be supported. In fact, the capacity of the states to mobilize funds has been decreased over the period through even the fiscal reforms in the overall budget term. We're talking of at the moment education budget, but the overall budget itself has shifted balance in favor of the center, and the state that center state balance needs to be restored so that they can fund education on their own as well for their own needs, and let not arm twisting be done through PM Shri schools and through the Eklavya schools, that you implement all the guidelines if you want funds of the NEP. This is what I would say. The ideal system would be where actually constitution is respected. Constitution gave a certain responsibility to the center, a certain responsibility to the state. Let that balance be restored.